Welcome to Sting Tao's podcast. Today, we're doing a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. How Japan, a place just steeped in tea culture for centuries, actually became a huge coffee consumer.
It really is a remarkable story. And we've got some great sources to unpack it. First, there's Coffee Market in Japan, Maxwell 11, which gives us the history and the numbers behind this whole shift.
Right, the data. And then
We'll look at food neophobia and its relation with olfaction. This one digs into the psychology, how we accept new tastes, and specifically how smell factors into trying new foods.
the neophobia aspect. Okay, and we've also got the strategy side covered, yeah, with Nestle.
Exactly. We have a few pieces on that. How Nestle created Japan's coffee culture by targeting kids. Another one on childhood advertising's long-term effects, and Nestle v. Japan's strategy for decades. Together, they really map out Nestle's, decades-long and pretty unconventional game plan.
Unconventional is right, and there's science backing this up too.
Yes. What we eat early in life influences our adult food preferences, gives us that scientific angle on how early taste experiences really stick with us.
Okay, and we'll also touch on the wider picture.
Yeah, just briefly, we've got a graph showing China's GDP growth from 1980 to 98, just to give some context about broader economic shifts happening in Asia around the same time.
Got it. So our mission today is to sort of untangle how history, marketing, even tapping into basic psychiatry, like this food neophobia idea and just fundamental human psychology all came together to change Japan's taste. We're really looking for those long-term impacts from maybe small beginnings.
Precisely. Especially those initiatives linked to our earliest experiences.
Okay, let's rewind then. Japan and tea.
Yeah.
Goes way back. So when does coffee even first appear on the scene?
Well, initially it was really limited. Just the Dutch residents down in Nagasaki, late 18th century, were the first ones encountering it. But it wasn't really for sale generally until the last quarter of the 19th century.
Late 1800s.
Okay. The first actual bulk import was 1877. And get this, it was only 18 metric tons for the whole year. Tiny.
18 tons in 1877. Wow. Okay, and the first actual coffee shop, like a place to go drink it.
That popped up in Tokyo in 1888. Coffee imports did grow, gradually. They hit a peak in 1937, 8,571 metric tons. But then World War II happened.
Right, that must have changed everything.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Imports just tanked in the 40s. In 1942, they only brought in 274 metric tons.
Just 244. So the war basically stopped it in its tracks. How long did that slump last?
Well, even after the war, during the Reconstruction in the 50s, consumption stayed really low. 1950, for instance, only 163 tons imported.
Still incredibly low. So what was the turning point?
A big one was 1961. That's when the government liberalized coffee imports. Suddenly, about 250,000 bags came in that year.
250,000 bags. How much is that in tons?
Roughly. If you figure about 60 kilos a bag, that's around 15,000 metric tons of green beans. So, yeah, a huge jump from the 50s.
Okay, a big jump, but compared to tea.
Still tiny. Compared to green tea, coffee was definitely a minor drink, mostly for, wealthier folks in the cities, adults. It wasn't mainstream yet.
So liberalization in 61 wasn't quite enough to make it ubiquitous.
Yeah.
What really pushed it over the edge?
1969. That seems to be the key year. That's when canned, ready-to-drink coffee hit the market. Hot and cold options.
Convenience.
Exactly. And this happened right as vending machines were exploding across Japan. I mean, eventually there were millions of them, and like half-sold drinks. Coffee was suddenly super accessible, especially for younger people.
Yeah.
Way more than making it yourself or going to a traditional coffee house.
That combination sounds potent. Canned coffee and vending machines everywhere.
It really fueled the growth. And fast forward a bit. According to that Coffee Market in Japan source, within about 40 years leading up to its publication, Japan had become the world's third largest coffee consumer among importing countries.
Third largest. From almost nothing a few decades earlier. That's staggering, especially given the tea culture.
It truly is an incredible transformation.
Okay, so that sets the scene historically. Now let's pivot to the strategy side. Nestle's role and this psychiatry connection seems crucial.
Right. So in the 1970s, Nestle was trying the usual marketing stuff for their coffee, spending quite a bit, but it just wasn't working. Japan was still very much tea territory.
Hitting a wall, basically.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
So they did something pretty out there. They brought in Clotaire Rapaille. He was a French child psychiatrist, but also a marketing consultant.
A child psychiatrist for coffee. That's definitely thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
What was his big idea?
Rapai's core concept was that we form really deep emotional bonds with tastes and smells from our childhood. His theory was that Japanese adults just didn't have those positive early memories with coffee, so they resisted it.
Okay.
So his advice was kind of radical. Stop trying so hard to sell coffee directly to adults.
Stop selling coffee to adults.
Well, great.
Who do you sell it to?
Well, not sell coffee exactly. His strategy was incredibly long-term. Starting in the late 70s, going into the 80s, Nestle began making coffee-flavored candies and desserts, things aimed squarely at kids.
Coffee jelly, coffee chocolates, that kind of...
Exactly that kind of thing. The goal wasn't immediate sales of those sweets. It was about planting a seed, creating positive, maybe even subconscious associations with the flavor of coffee in the next generation.
Wow. That's playing the long game. I mean, decades long? What, was there pushback internally? That sounds risky.
Oh, I'm sure there were concerns. How long until we see results? Will kids even like this stuff? But they stuck with it, apparently really buying into Rapai's psychological angle on how these early tastes get imprinted.
Okay, so they plant these coffee flavor seeds in childhood. When did they start to see it pay off?
By the 1980s, that generation, the kids who grew up tasting coffee flavor in sweets, they started entering the workforce. They already knew the taste, maybe even liked it, and now they actually needed caffeine, right?
Ah, so the need meets the pre-existing positive association.
Precisely. So when Nestle came back around with instant coffee aimed at that generation, the reception was totally different, much more open than their parents had been.
That is just a masterclass in long-term strategy based on understanding psychology. What was the ultimate result for the market and for Nestle?
It was huge. By 2014, Japan wasn't just a major consumer, it was the world's fourth largest coffee importer, over 500,000 tons a year. And Nestle, they became a market leader in Japan's coffee scene.
Incredible. It really shows how understanding maybe even of basic psychiatry principles can shape markets over time. And there's research that backs this up, right? About childhood advertising.
Yeah, exactly. That source, how childhood advertising exposure can influence long-term attitudes. It basically says positive feelings linked to brands you saw advertised a lot as a kid, especially before you're, say, 13. Those feelings can stick around and bias your judgments years later.
So those early positive vibes really do create lasting preferences. It wasn't just a hunch by Rapay. There's science there.
Seems so. Those early exposures embed themselves quite deeply.
Okay, this leads perfectly into the science of why. Let's talk about this food neophobia and the power of early taste exposure.
Right. So food neophobia, as that article describes it, is just this reluctance, this hesitation to try foods you haven't had before. It likely has evolutionary roots, avoid poison, stay safe.
Makes sense, but it can also stop you from trying good stuff.
Exactly. It can limit your diet. And scientists have been studying this since the 90s, developing tools like the food neophobia scale to measure how strong this tendency is in people.
And the article mentioned a link to smell, olfaction.
Yeah, that's interesting. It suggests a connection between being neophobic and your senses, particularly smell. Some studies found that people who are more hesitant about new foods, they don't do as much exploratory sniffing.
They don't sniff it out as much.
Kind of. And one study from 2013 actually found that highly neophobic people were significantly worse at identifying common smells. The thinking is maybe they just haven't been exposed to as many different smells because they avoid new food experiences.
That's a fascinating feedback loop. Avoid new foods, less smell exposure, maybe worse at identifying smells, but potentially reinforcing the avoidance?
It could work something like that. Now, about the early exposure itself.
Yes. The time...
That's where what we eat early in life comes in. They did research with mice. Mice exposed to lots of different tastes early on, like during weaning, showed a much stronger preference for sweet tastes later in adulthood compared to mice that didn't get that variety.
Okay. Early variety mattered for later preference. What if they got the variety later, as adults?
Didn't have the same effect. The mice exposed to taste variety only as adults didn't show that same shift in preference. This really points to a critical window early in life for setting these taste preferences.
A critical window. That feels really key.
It absolutely is. The research points to changes in the brain's taste center, the gustatory cortex, involving specific types of neurons. Basically, the brain circuits are more adaptable, more plastic early on. They even suggested they might be able to manipulate these circuits in adult mice to sort of reopen that window.
Wow. And the article also mentioned we just tend to like foods from our childhood, right? The cultural element.
Yes, it reinforces that idea too.
Yeah.
What you grow up with often becomes your comfort food, your preferred taste. It all ties together.
So Nestle's strategy of getting that coffee flavor in early, it aligns perfectly with this science hitting that critical window for taste development.
It looks that way. They were essentially programming a future preference, overcoming potential neophobia before it could really take hold for coffee.
Okay, let's jump back to the market data around 2010. How were people actually drinking coffee in Japan by then?
Right. So, according to Coffee Market in Japan, 1 out of 11, by 2010, average weekly consumption was up slightly from 2008, hitting about 10.9 cups.
Almost 11 cups a week on average.
Mhm.
And what kind of coffee was it mostly?
Soluble coffee, like instant, was the biggest chunk, 43%, about 4.7 cups a week. Then came roasted and ground coffee at 30%, that's around 3.3 cups. Canned coffee was 17%, almost 1.9 cups. And liquid coffee made up the last 10%, just over a cup a week.
Instant and R&G leading the way. And where was this coffee being consumed? Did the traditional coffee shops make a comeback?
Actually, no. The big shift was towards drinking it at home. That accounted for 62% of consumption in 2010, about 6.7 cups a week.
Wow, nearly two-thirds at home.
Yeah, and drinking at work or school also jumped up significantly to 26%, nearly 3 cups a week. But those traditional coffee houses, their share dropped drastically, down to only 3% of consumption, just zero point 0.3 cups a week.
So convenience really won out. Home, work, school, places where instant or maybe canned coffee fit easily.
It certainly looks that way. The data also showed, for 2010 at least, that men drank a bit more coffee than women, and the peak consumption age group for both was 40 to 59. Younger people were drinking less at that point.
Interesting demographic snapshot there. Now, that report also stressed the ready-to-drink market, the RTD coffee.
Oh, absolutely. That's described as a really unique feature of Japan's beverage market, and it was the biggest segment by sales value. In 2010, we're talking shipments of over 3 million kiloliters of RTD coffee.
3 million kiloliters. That's a lot of canned and bottled coffee.
It is, and the sales value was over a trillion yen. Big business.
Definitely. What was the breakdown within RTD in 2010?
Canned coffee was still king then. It made up about 65.5% of the volume, over 2 million kiloliters, and almost 80% of the sales value, like 806 billion yen.
So cans dominated. What about other formats?
Putty bottles had a smaller share, around 16% of volume and 9% of value. But the report noted that chilled cup coffee, those ones you find in convenience store fridges, their sales had grown quite a bit in the 5 years before 2010, even though their overall share was still smaller. About 7-8% of volume and value then.
Okay, so cans were dominant in RTD circa 2010, but chilled cups were gaining ground. Now, just quickly, that China GDP graph. What did it show again?
Right. It basically showed China's economy, measured in their currency, growing pretty steadily from 1980 up to 1998. The line just keeps going up, maybe even accelerating a bit in the later 80s and 90s.
So a period of significant economic expansion in the region, overlapping with when Japan's coffee habit was really taking off. Any connection there?
Well, it suggests a broader context, right? As economies in Asia were developing, societies were changing, becoming more affluent. This often leads to shifts in consumption, more openness to new things, maybe more westernization, as one of the sources put it, which could include adopting things like coffee.
Okay, putting it all together then, this whole journey from tea to coffee in Japan, what are the big takeaways?
I think the biggest one is how this massive cultural shift wasn't just an accident. It was driven by really long-term strategic thinking that was deeply informed by, well, understanding human psychology. Nestle's patience, focusing on kids and flavor association based on psychiatric insights. That was key.
They didn't fight the existing adult preference head-on. They cultivated a future preference.
Exactly. And the science we discussed about food neophobia and that critical window for taste development in childhood, it really backs up why that strategy worked so well over decades. Introduce the flavor early, make it positive, and you sidestep some of that natural resistance later on.
And the rise of convenience, like the canned coffee and vending machines, just cemented it into daily life.
Absolutely. It made the switch easy once the preference was there.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Could these kinds of long-term approaches, understanding basic psychology or early experiences, be used for other things, like maybe promoting healthier habits?
That's a really powerful question. If you understand how these preferences form, how to introduce things positively during that critical window, could you apply that to encourage kids towards healthier foods, for example? Overcoming that neophobia for vegetables instead of coffee. It seems plausible.
The potential implications are quite broad, beyond just marketing coffee.
Definitely. Whether for commercial goals or public health ones, understanding these deep-seated psychological mechanisms seems vital.
So this whole Japanese coffee story is really a case study in patience, psychological insight, and long-term vision leading to really profound change. It leaves you wondering, what small seeds are being planted today, maybe using similar insights into how we work, that could grow into huge cultural shifts down the road?
It's a fascinating thought. What preferences are being shaped right now that will define consumption or even culture in 20, 30 years?
Something for all of us to think about. And maybe a prompt to look more closely at the psychology behind our own choices. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive on Stingtao's podcast.